stream. And we are at the very end of chapter 7. All right. So, just get this stuff out of the way. Got too much crap on my desk. So, we talked about the election between Jefferson and Adams, and the way the whole presidency and vice presidency worked out back then, which is weird, but you get what you get. The various issues during Adams' presidency, the XYZ affair, which resulted in a 2-year undeclared war with France, mostly just things happening between ships on the ocean. There weren't any major battles, but we were not in good relations with France. And then the Alien and Sedition Acts, the Alien Act, Naturalization Act, and Sedition Act, which all really granted a lot more power to the central government and had the president specifically cracking down on citizens. So we've got, we'll actually discuss this in greater detail next semester. And this one too, actually. All right. So, leading up to the next election in 1800, the Democratic Republicans, which are, the Anti-Federalists, used the Alien and Sedition Acts to label the Federalists as the New British because, well, there was a lot of central power, and a lot of people in America didn't trust the government having a lot of power. And there was a lot of dissent among the states as to whether the central government should have that much power, or the Federalists in general. The election was close, and there were a lot of really personal attacks between the candidates, disparaging each other's family and just really dirty stuff. The sort of thing you wouldn't think would have happened in the 1700s. Well, now at this point, 1800. It's more modern politics. But yeah, politics back then sucked too. Everybody was just awful to everybody else. In the end, though, Jefferson won. Technically, Aaron Burr, which was Jefferson's running mate, won the same amount of electoral votes as he did, but because they were running as president and vice presidential candidates, Jefferson technically was given the win. Which, again, I'll show you guys an election map in a minute. The elections back then were still a little bit weird. They had decided against the whoever comes in second becomes the vice president, and basically everyone was running as president. I don't know. It's just weird. Not super important for the class, but I just want to let you guys know, things haven't been the way they are, especially when it comes to the way the government runs. Jefferson called his revolution, and I actually read here from the book. Labeled his election a revolution achieved not by the sword, but by the suffrage of the people, which is all well and good, but only about 500,000 of the 5.3 million people in the United States could actually vote. They had a very, what's the word? It's like the Athenian democracy. I can't remember the term. It's a very strict form of democracy, where, obviously, this is 1800, so women couldn't vote. Obviously, African Americans couldn't vote, considering most of them were enslaved, but even the freed slaves couldn't vote. And even among, white men, only a small percentage could actually vote because you had to own a certain amount of land. You needed to basically be able to be worth a certain amount of money. So if you were a landless farmer, sharecropper, that sort of thing, you didn't get to vote. You were considered rabble, and basically your vote wouldn't be worth counting. All that said, the election did have two very aggressively opposed parties, but when time came to change hands for the Federalists to step down, there was a peaceful transfer of power, which in 1800 wasn't very common. Typically, if you wanted to change heads of state in another country, it would be very bloody. So, despite the fact that they weren't exactly civil to one another, the transfer of power was at least peaceful. So here we have the electoral votes. Jefferson with 73, where are we at? And Burr also with 73. Adams came out with 65, Pinckney with 64. Jay was also there apparently, John Jay. And a lot of states, as you can see, actually split their electorates because they were so close. So unlike today, where if you win by a couple of thousand, you get the whole state, they actually would split votes based on district. Still, though, it came out in Jefferson's favor, with Burr, again, technically getting just as many, but because Burr and Jefferson were running as, running mates, they were made president and vice president. So, there it is. Before the ratification of the 12th Amendment, each elector cast votes for two different candidates. The candidate with the highest number became president, while the candidate with the second highest became vice president. Yeah, so I guess technically we were still running in the old Adams way of doing things, but that was changed in 1804. So, by the way, that's the 12th Amendment, is to fix this crap. We only really talk about the first 10, but anyway. That's it for this chapter. Despite America having secured its independence, things were still pretty rough. Economic hardship was immediate. Natives and European powers causing a great deal of conflict on the frontier, and with the European powers having their conflicts, it created issues on the ocean as well. Still, though, we had many swift changes that kept things from completely falling apart. Washington being the consummate leader that he was, Hamilton being able to quickly bring the economy to, a working order, and changing the Articles of Confederation to a stronger constitution made it so that, we didn't immediately fall apart. Still, though, there were setbacks. Things were not all, the triumphant underdog story like you like to see in movies. Washington didn't like the idea of political parties. He said that it would bring ruin to the nation, and yet within his presidency, the factions were already forming. And the Federalists and Democratic Republicans would be the leaders of power in the United States, at least until the War of 1812, but we'll get to that, Chapter 9. So, that's it for Chapter 7. If I can get my mouse back over here. Let's bring up Chapter 8. Where were we in? Oh, we finished it last time. Okay. Let's see. Where were we in? Let's see, too. This was an instance of me putting the title in first, and black PowerPoint's like, hey, we've got a background that would work great with that. It's like, yeah, sure, why not? And it's this. Spoilers, we're not going to space in the 1800s. But I don't know, I just decided to keep it. So, taking a step back a little bit, back from the election of 1800, there's the creation of this American identity. We formed really our own form of education to an extent. I mean, obviously, it's based heavily on British education. That's what we knew for generations. But there was a slight shift. For example, Noah Webster began working on his American spelling book to standardize spelling pronunciation of words in America. And by 1810, it was the second best-selling book in the United States. And it's Noah Webster's fault that we have spellings differently between American words and British words. He got rid of a lot of the U's, changed a lot of S's to Z's, just to be different. Like, there wasn't any real reason behind it. It was just, we're a different culture now, and we have to have a different spelling of words just to make things confusing. So, that's what that's about. And then, by 1828, he published his American Dictionary of the English Language. This is why we have, for the most part, if you find a dictionary, it's a Webster's dictionary. It's because of this guy. So, especially, I remember grade school, like every year we had to get like one of those little pocket dictionaries that you never used, but it's like, you got to have a dictionary and a thesaurus. It's like, okay, cool, it's going to take up space in my backpack. Well, it's this guy's fault. The first state to use free elementary education was Massachusetts back in 1789, which was still, I mean, it's elementary education, so it's like the first couple of grades of, modern grade school or primary school, whatever you want to call it. So certainly not higher education, but way more education than people had in the past. I mean, being able to read at all was actually pretty rare at this time. So at least getting children to be able to read was a major step forward. Because if you can't read, you can't absorb the information of the day, really. You can only have it told to you, and that's not going to be unbiased. With reading, at least you can check different sources and whatnot. When it came to colleges, the 9 that existed in the U.S. had been established under the reign of Britain. So many Americans were worried that they would carry the taint of Britain. Oh no, because the British were the ones that founded it, therefore their bias was British. I don't know. I mean, today some of our biggest universities are actually from this time period. So frontier towns, which is to say towns on the western ends of the states we already had, typically not too far west yet, they became models for these new colleges, this new American way of doing things. And being on the frontier, that was also seen as very American. Obviously, any natives that lived in these towns had to be run out because they needed more land to build these colleges. So, as with everything the American government's doing, is going to hurt the natives. So one of these colleges, these new frontier schools, was Franklin College, which is in Athens, Georgia, which I lived not far from Athens, Georgia for a while when I was upstate. So that is relatively far west in Georgia. Allowed for groups outside of Anglo-Americans to actually go to school and have an education and then therefore affect America as it continued to grow. In particular, this was heavily populated by the Scots-Irish Presbyterians, which were typically not treated well by the Anglo-American majority. Because while we aren't British anymore, we're still just as biased against everyone else as the British were, particularly the Scots-Irish. Anyway, there's Webster. Here's Franklin College. Looking at this and forgetting that it's actually in Athens, Georgia, it makes me think of Providence College up in Rhode Island, where I went for grad school, because architecturally it looked a lot like this. I don't actually know how old Providence College is. I should check that. But like the architecture was very similar to this. It had the same sort of, sign out front that was all in brick. And then, of course, all the fall foliage makes me think of it being, much cooler weather, which, as I say, again, up in Rhode Island. But this is Athens, Georgia, so it could just as well be 40 degrees or like 80 degrees because, well, it's Georgia. We know that. We're here in South Carolina. It's not any different. Well, Athens is at least further upstate, so it's probably not too bad. They at least don't have the humidity quite as bad. I was running out of room, so apologies for that. That's literary and cultural developments. There's a lot here, but I wanted to get it all on one slide. Either it had been like a bunch on one and a very little bit on the other, or just like squeeze in the last little bit. So that's what I decided to go with. So the colleges created a new literary tradition that was very specifically American, although it was often led by people who had a more federalist view of things. We had the Hartford Wits, typically graduates of Yale, that pushed this new idea. And around this time, novels became very popular, with women being the largest consumers of novels. This is something that we actually see multiple times throughout history, not just American history, but like even going back to Europe. Anytime there's a boom of reading material, novels or short stories or whatever, it's typically the women that are the ones pushing that because they're not allowed to do anything else in society, so they typically are huge in reading these things. And a lot of times women would be authors, but obviously they'd have to have a pseudonym so that they could publish as a man, because, women can't write, even though they clearly are. So speaking of novels, we have Washington Irving. He was one of the most popular at the time. We still know of him today. Wrote The Legend of Sleepy Hollow that most people are familiar with, as well as Rip Van Winkle that I've not actually read. I forget what it's about. It's sort of similar to Sleepy Hollow in that it's set in like a real setting, but it's got supernatural elements. And both of these drew on the Dutch culture of the Hudson River Valley. That's why, like, if you're familiar with, that was not a good sound. If you're familiar with, like, European writing, and then you go back and read, say, Sleepy Hollow, it feels like it's taking place in Europe because it's focused so much on the culture of the European immigrants that were there in the Hudson River Valley. It's not something I can really describe. I'm not a English major. But when you know what European literature looks like and then you read this early stuff, it's like, yeah, we're still pretty well connected with Europe. He also wrote more serious essays, in particular essays that looked at the English, well, Native and English conflicts, and challenged how positive they were written, because obviously when a bunch of English, or at this point American, soldiers go in and like slaughter a village, it's written in a way that, oh, we had this great battle and we're victorious, and we're going to ignore the fact that it was mostly women and children we were killing. Whereas Irving went back and looked over these accounts and was like, not many of these natives we were killing were combatants. But what are you going to do? There was also a lot of books that were already mystifying the past, even though, like, if this is, say, 1800, we've only been a nation for like 20 years. Well, a little less. Mercy Otis Warren wrote the History of the American Revolution. Does the book actually go into detail on that one? I don't remember. 3-volume History of the Revolution by Mercy Otis Warren. Mason Parson Weems wrote The Life of Washington, which the book describes as a celebratory if somewhat fanciful biography by an Anglican clergyman. That's why his middle name was Parson. That's an Anglican thing. Anyway, yeah, so already, like, I'm pretty sure Washington isn't dead yet, but we've already got a, like, legend, mystified, I should say, account of Washington's life. So not entirely a true biography, but, it was important because that was the order of the day. There's also lots of art of historical themes. Let's see. Charles William Peale painted portraits of Washington. Samuel Jennings painted Liberty displaying the arts and sciences, which I've got an image of, and there's a lot of symbolism to it, some of which very, very blatant. In particular, Lady Liberty was offering books to African Americans, which, it's really obvious of, like, here's the symbol of freedom teaching African Americans how to read and become educated, because, let's see, Jennings, many of the library's directors opposed slavery, and Jennings portrayed Lady Liberty offering a book to the group of attentive African Americans. There's other stuff as well, which I'll show you guys in a minute. There was also a lot of scientific engravings of the day. Let's see. Cleveland's treatise on mineralogy and geology, engravings of rock formations, and William Bartram's travels illustrated his travels to Florida, which in particular, let's see, based on his journey to the southeastern United States and Florida, illustrated plants and animals such as the alligator, previously unknown to Anglo-American scientists. Yeah, can you imagine, like, seeing an alligator for the first time ever? Yeah, people weren't quite ready for that. The murder log. This is all I could find for there was a lot I could find for Sleepy Hollow, but I couldn't get a sort of, like, really old-looking book like I usually do. So, yeah, Sleepy Hollow, in case you weren't familiar. Let's see. This is the Portrait of Washington by Charles William Peale, I believe. Again, a lot of symbolism here. You've got the various flags, cannons, because, again, being the general, and then a lot of other stuff that I actually am not entirely familiar with in terms of the symbolism, but it's all there. Here we are. Lady Liberty, or Liberty displaying the arts and sciences. So, again, you've got these very attentive folks here, Lady Liberty with books, and also you've got just, like, symbols of culture, a Roman bust, the Corinthian column, more books over here, a globe, a harp, I believe. So, again, like the arts. And up here is something really important. Do you guys remember? I'm pretty sure I told you guys what this was before. Does anyone remember what this is? This is a Phrygian cap, which is an ancient Roman symbol that symbolizes a freed slave. This is very specifically an emancipation symbol. Back in Rome, slavery wasn't so much about race as it was like being captured in battle or just having your land taken by the Romans. And so a lot of slaves weren't like agricultural slaves like in North America, but just would do stuff the Romans didn't feel like doing, including even like tutoring their kids. A lot of folks taken from Greece were just made into tutors. And a lot of times the Roman slave owners would free their slaves, but so that they wouldn't be mistaken as escaped slaves, they would be given these little caps to wear as a symbol of their freedom. And this is used a lot in early American art, I should say, including the various state seals. I think it was Delaware, maybe? It was one of the states kind of in the mid-Atlantic. Their state seal has a lot going on, but it also includes like a Phrygian cap. Ours is just that's the state flag. But same idea, it's the palmetto tree. But some states have very, very detailed and honestly overdone, oftentimes, state flags. And a lot of those have this. And it wasn't because they were calling for the emancipation of slaves. This was a symbol of our freedom from the big air quotes slavery of being under British rule. So, obviously, American culture was largely created by Anglo-Americans. People other than Anglo-Americans were often used as symbols. For example, Native Americans were used as symbols of protest against economic and political tyranny, which we saw in the Boston Tea Party, and it continued on after that. Riders of Hudson River Valley, the Whiskey Rebellion, squatters in Maine would disguise themselves as Native Americans for attacking landlords, which again, like, very rarely was an actual act of disguise and more an act of symbolism. They were dressing as Native Americans because Native Americans to them symbolized this freedom of tyranny, freedom from tyranny, I should say. Tammany societies were named after the Delaware chief Tammand and promoted patriotism and republicanism. So there was this sort of like holding up Native Americans as this ideal while they were also still considered like, subhuman savages. Because, Americans are real good at doing two things at the same time. For example, Philip Freneau, I don't know. He wrote Indian Burying Ground, which talked about the lost heritage of the natives who had pretty much lost their culture thanks to the encroachment of the European powers. I mean, and a lot of them, it was a case of get rid of your culture and become good Christians, or we'll murder you, and the murder usually came anyway. So obviously, views of Native Americans and African Americans tended to be from the whites because they were the ones with the education. If you can't get educated in order to be able to read and write, it's very hard to write about your people and your culture and your struggles because you're purposely left uneducated. As we mentioned back with the praying towns, some Native Americans were allowed to enroll in schools, but typically it was to become ministers to go back to their tribes to convert them. Very, very rarely were Native Americans allowed to actually learn things other than how to be good Christians and then go back to try to make their people be good Christians. Obviously, African Americans were discouraged from any kind of education, particularly in the South, which, again, in the South, most of the white citizens were uneducated poor farmers. So just a lot of uneducation in the South. Weird. And even in the North, while they were maybe not disbarred from education, any kind of governmental organization that came together to make education more available to more people did not include the African American population in their plans. So if they wanted to get an education, it was typically through, organizations that they made themselves, in particular the African Methodist Church, because a lot of the ministers there had received some level of education, and they could come together and teach them at least to, again, read and write. It's really the start of any level of education. And the real difference here in many Anglo-Americans' mindsets was that Native Americans were uncivilized but could be educated, while Africans were seen as simply inferior. I'm sure that has nothing to do with the economic concerns when it came to keeping people uneducated and enslaved, but whatever. We'll just pretend like that has something to do with anything. Let's see. Philip Freneau. Indian Burying Ground is a long poem, and I couldn't find any kind of excerpts from it. Wasn't just like this long thing of the poem. So normally I'd pull an excerpt from it, but I couldn't find any. All right. So, further racial issues in North America at this time. We had the North African Union Society. They were a group in Rhode Island that wanted to establish a community for American blacks back in Africa. Basically, the idea was to purchase some amount of land or just go over and colonize some amount of land and basically repatriate African Americans back to Africa, which, I'll get more into in just a minute. William Thornton, for example, he was a Quaker that inherited a sugar plantation, worked with a group in London where they established a free black commonwealth on the west coast of Africa. I believe this was Liberia? I don't remember which country it became. I think it might have just been called the Gold Coast at this time. The Free African Society in Philadelphia were not a fan of this, which I'll get more into in just a minute. Whites called it colonization. Black Americans called it immigration. It depended on your viewpoint, I guess. There was also the American Colonization Society, southern slave owners and northern merchants that decided that they would be willing to free their slaves, but only by creating this again colony of freed blacks in Western Africa in order to carry civilization and Christianity to Africa in this regard, because obviously the only ones that would be allowed to go over would be the good Christian slaves. So before I bring up the next one, I'm going to throw this to you guys. Why would groups oppose this idea? Why would some groups oppose this idea of, sending African Americans back to Africa, then they won't be enslaved anymore, including the Free African Society in Philadelphia? So this wasn't just like Southern planters that were like, oh, we can't get rid of slaves because of the economy. What would be the major argument against this from the viewpoint of, say, the African Americans in North America?
Wouldn't it be like similar colonialism? Like, there's already.
I mean, it's literally American Colonization Society. In a way, both of you are right. But there's a social aspect to it, I guess, is what I'm looking for.
Right. We want to civilize Africa by sending the whitest of the slaves back to Africa to bring civilization to them.
Again, that's part of it, but I mean, you none of you are expected to know this. I was just seeing what you guys would think. It's easing racial tensions by doing what? Yeah. It eased racial tensions by getting rid of black people entirely. Now, granted, the idea was, oh, we'll just send them back to where they came from. But, like, a lot of them had not been born in Africa and were several generations removed from Africa. And even if they were from Africa, they weren't going to be from this spot that we were sending them to. Africa is a big place. But, yeah, it was more about prejudice than philanthropy. This wasn't for the good of the slaves or the former slaves. It was so that the white folks could feel good about themselves and that they were getting rid of the racism problem by getting rid of an entire race of people. Yeah, it was. It didn't take much to look between the lines and be like, no, this is just really freaking racist.
Yeah, and then the people who are actually in Liberia suffered from having.
Right, you got more people dumped in. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yes. But again, that didn't matter because we're bringing them civilization, so it's for their own good. None of this actually ended up mattering because after the 1790s, cotton production exploded and very few slave owners were willing to free their slaves. So these were just a bunch of ideas that came about right before the cotton gin happened, and suddenly people were way more concerned about economics than the lives of people. But this was a thing that was happening, and it's important enough to include for sure, because there was for a moment this whole like maybe we shouldn't have slaves, but also we're still really racist, so we can't have them running around here in America. So this is the Newport African Union Society. It's a little tiny church there in Rhode Island. This may well be Providence because it was hilly as hell there. It was a pain in the butt to park. Everything was all smushed together, and it was not flat at all. I remember that. Free African Society, leadership of Richard Allen and Absalom Jones. So we remember Richard Allen from a chapter or two ago now. He was the one that, founded the first independent African church. Forerunner of the first African American, The Office of the Colonization Society, which feels weird considering we had just fought against being colonies, but whatever. It's fine totally. All right. So we teased this a little bit last chapter. The new capital was called Washington City, would eventually become D.C., but right now it's Washington City. Was built along the Potomac River, largely by enslaved men, because obviously we're still in, technically, Virginia. So, yeah. Now that said, there were a lot of people involved in the construction of this city. Free blacks were hired on, so technically they were being paid, but because, melanin is scary, they were still given the same garbage jobs as the slaves. There were some interesting individuals, such as Benjamin Banneker, self-taught African-American clockmaker, astronomer, and surveyor. He worked with the surveyor Major Andrew Ellicott to actually plot the area out to build the Capitol. Obviously, he couldn't do it himself because just because he had the education to do it doesn't mean he'd be allowed to do it on his own. So technically, he assisted another surveyor, but he was doing a lot of work. Irish immigrants were also there in large numbers, but due to slave labor being a thing, they were paid very, very poorly. Because if the competition for your labor is people who aren't being paid at all, you're not going to be paid very much. Still, though, regardless of race, the workers there were not given much in the way of anything. Poor housing, sparse meals, limited medical care, and, as we've mentioned, lots of malaria. Because D.C. was built on a swamp, and when they're first building it, it's just all swamp. So despite Washington City meant to be this symbol of our new nation, most of the people who built it were experts from Europe. We had Pierre Lafont, you can tell from the name, the French engineer. He helped to lay out the streets. James Hoban, Irishman, behind the Executive Mansion. William Thornton, I guess he was also Irish, helped design the Capitol building. Benjamin Latrobe, English architect who helped to direct the construction of the city at large. And despite all the, what was cutting edge technology of the day, the Capitol was still a swamp. And Abigail Adams complained about it quite a bit once she and her husband John moved to the new Capitol. Because, as I've said, D.C. or Washington City was not built in Washington's time. So John Adams was actually the first president to use the Capitol. And I will read you a lovely excerpt from the book when it talks about the state of the city. So, let's see. The location on the slow-moving river and its clay soil left the area hot, humid, and dusty in the summer, muddy and damp in the winter and spring. Also, mosquitoes, because slow-moving water. The mile-long road from the Capitol to the Executive Mansion was filled with tree stumps and was nearly impossible to navigate in a carriage. On rainy days when roads proved impassable, officials walked or rode horses to work. November, Abigail Adams moved into the Executive Mansion. She complained that the roof leaked, the huge house was hard to heat, and firewood was difficult to obtain, which is crazy, just imagining all the forest we have, which I guess in a swamp you don't have a lot of trees necessarily. Abigail Adams was not alone in criticizing the capital city. The founders considered it an experiment in Republican simplicity. Many residents painted Washington in harsh tones. Representative, yada, yada, yada. If I wished to punish a culprit, I would send him to do penance in this place, this swamp, this lonesome, dreary swamp, secluded from every delightful or pleasing thing. Others described the city as a fever-stricken morass. D.C., again, Washington City, I should say, did not have a good first impression on much of anybody. And honestly, because of the way it's situated, I saw a thing, I think it was on the Weather Channel. If a hurricane were to come straight up the Potomac, the entire city would be underwater because it's really low, and right there once again on the river. And if a hurricane were to come up the Potomac, it would just run the entire river over the city. So here's some of the folks. L'Enfant. I guess I only have L'Enfant. Now this is from 60? I can't tell what that number is. I think that's a 6. So this is much later. But as you can see, they're building, I think that's the Capitol building. Or at least rebuilding it, remodeling it. But everything is swampy and gross and muddy. Yeah. I mean, I went there, geez, it's been a few years now. But, I came out of the subway into the middle of the Capitol lawn. And the first thing I noticed is it was really humid. Now, obviously, today they don't have mosquitoes as bad because of, spraying and stuff, but it's still very much a swamp. So, from Adams back to Jefferson, the first thing Jefferson did was to limit federal power because that was his whole party's thing. Let's see. They repealed the whiskey tax, let the Alien and Sedition Acts expire. That was something that you had to go in and basically reinforce every couple of years. Bless you. Albert Gallatin was made the Secretary of the Treasury. He had been a lawyer on the side of the Whiskey Rebels back during that whole thing. And he helped Jefferson with reducing government expenditure. He's going to be super important in a little while when we talk about the various internal improvements that are made. But we'll get to that. Really, I think we don't talk about that too much until the next chapter. Because I know we have the War of 1812. Yeah, government fuels expense. Yeah, okay. So we'll talk about the whole canal thing next chapter. But Gallatin will be back. Jefferson also was dealing with a major confederation of pirates in the Mediterranean. They basically had control over most of northern Africa and were so powerful that the United States had to pay tribute to them so that they wouldn't attack our ships. Jefferson's government worked with the Ottoman Empire to try and capture Tripoli to break the back of this pirate confederation. And the only thing we were able to get out of it was they lowered the amount of payments we had to give them so they'd leave us alone. I don't know why we've got all these movies about the pirates in the Caribbean when you've got this crazy stuff going on, like pirate kingdoms. But whatever. Guess it's not American-centric enough. We also had the Haitian Revolution. There's a lot to this. So this was during the French Revolution. They granted the revolutionary government granted freedom to the slaves in Saint Dominique, but the landowners there refused to abide by the new law. So the freed blacks in Saint Dominique, which were not a small number, managed to get the slaves to rise up, and they had their big revolution. Dang it. And while this was happening, the British and Spanish came in to make things worse for the French. However, once the French were kicked out of Saint Dominique, the British and Spanish tried to take the island because, you can't let a bunch of freed slaves run that place. So they immediately turned and fought the British and Spanish off the island. This was largely led by Toussaint Louverture, became the first president of the Haiti Republic, and for a while they worked with the new Napoleonic government, but Napoleon decided he wanted Haiti back, Saint Dominique back, which led to Toussaint Louverture being captured and dying in a French prison, because again, prisons back then were basically death sentences. However, just because Louverture was captured and died did not mean the Haitian rebels were willing to just roll over. So by November of 1803, Napoleon pulled his troops out and let Haiti do what it wanted, and Haiti secured its independence, being the first black-led nation in the Americas, and the first nation, at least in the Americas, I don't know if maybe even overall, that was created due to a slave rebellion. Now, I'm going to jump forward like 200 years here. So Haiti today is one of the poorest nations in the world, and that's not a mistake. That's not just something that happened. Immediately after this, European powers and America basically kept constant pressure on Haiti, kept their economy in a depressed state, refused to trade with them or trade with them in a way that helped Haiti. So basically they were kept in a constant state of economic turmoil, and also being out in the middle of the Mediterranean, I always do that, the middle of the Caribbean. Anytime a big hurricane came through, they typically got flattened, and due to, once again, their economy being essentially destroyed by outside nations, they never could fully rebuild. So today, the big issue in Haiti is a lot of corruption in the government, but that's also not entirely not outside nations' fault. So despite Haiti gaining its independence and becoming the first black-led nation in the Americas, the white nations couldn't let that just happen without them messing it up. So FYI, if somebody complains about Haiti, it's like, oh, Haiti is this, cesspool of corruption. It's like, yeah, well, it ain't entirely their fault. Just FYI. So here are the Barbary states of North Africa. So basically everything from the border of Egypt to like the west coast were under the control of these pirates. Now, they didn't necessarily control the inland areas. In fact, a lot of this is pretty close to the Sahara. But they did have these major cities along the coast that they helped to project their power in the Mediterranean and even in the Atlantic. And there's Tripoli here. There we are. was like the main capital that we tried to take, but it didn't quite work out. Oh, right. So, speaking of Haiti, I may have mentioned the way, I don't know if I have mentioned, there's two ways to hang a person. The legal way, what was used in, legal executions, like if you've ever seen a Western movie, you've probably seen this, where they tie the noose around the person's neck and they drop the platform out from under them and they fall, and if it works right, it's supposed to break their neck, and that's like instantly kill them, more or less. They might twitch a little bit, but it's pretty fast. Then there's this way of doing it, where they're still very much alive. You tie the noose around their neck and then lift them up with typically, their hands tied behind their back. Maybe leave their legs untied so they can kick. This is a slow and painful way of doing it. This was often how people who were lynched were hanged because, well, they're not going to build a whole gallows for it. They're just going to haul the person up. So yeah, obviously during the Haiti Revolution, when they were getting rid of their French overlords, this was very much done on purpose. As you can see, they built a lot of them. There's Cessant Louverture with just like the most incredible outfit. And I don't know what is going on with this sword. The sword almost doesn't look real. I mean, I know this isn't, a drawing, but like it looks like something from a freaking fantasy game or something. It's crazy. It's great. That's a really good sword. Okay, I was trying to say. Right. So, speaking of the French, Jefferson sent James Monroe to France to request that they sell us rights to use the Mediterranean. Geez, I can't have words today. Well, like that's not normal for me. To use the Mississippi River, because once again, it's like the biggest river in the country. We physically have access to half of it, but anytime you've got two countries on opposite sides of the river, there's going to be a dispute over who has control over that river. So Jefferson was going to pay Napoleon $2 million to use the Mississippi River. Napoleon's counteroffer was, give me $15 million, you can have the whole damn thing. The river, the land, all of it. We can't use the Louisiana Territory right now because we're fighting Britain, and Britain has destroyed our fleet, so we can't even get there anymore. How about you give us a little bit of money and just take the thing off our hands? $15 million was like 2 cents an acre, something like that. It was an obscenely good price. However, if you recall from last time, Jefferson was a Democratic Republican, which means he had a very strict reading of the Constitution. And the Constitution had nothing to say about buying land from a foreign power. So in the mind of Jefferson, and technically the other Democratic Republicans, if the Constitution doesn't say you can do something, then you can't. So Jefferson really wanted to buy this land because it really helped. It gives us all this new agricultural land, and Jefferson's, gets a real hard on when it comes to the agricultural stuff. But also it goes against his ideals as a Democratic Republican. But Jefferson was like the only one agonizing over this. Everyone else, politicians, regular folk, basically everyone but the Native Americans we were going to run over in a few years, really wanted this to happen. So Jefferson let it happen, and they did the Louisiana Purchase. Typically, when we talk about the Louisiana Purchase, it's like, hey, it's the thing. We bought land from Napoleon and all his, or really even just France, and everything was great. But I really want to emphasize how much of a problem it was for Jefferson, despite the fact that everyone else was cool with it. So, I don't know. Jefferson was funny that way. So, obviously, we sent out the Corps of Discovery, exploratory expedition. This was, of course, Lewis and Clark, Captain Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, led by Sacagawea. There were a lot of other natives who were involved in the trek, but typically they would go along with the group for a certain percentage of the route, and then they would get to another territory, another native's territory, and would stop there, and then more would come in and help out. So it wasn't just these two dudes and Sacagawea. In fact, there was also a man named York. He was a slave that worked with Clark. He was a scout, so he was very important in going ahead and making sure that things were passable. And after the expedition ended and they came back to, I believe, St. Louis, Clark was given his freedom. Well, the book says he gained his freedom, which I don't know if that means when they got back, Clark's like, you know what, you did a lot of great work. You can be free now. Or if when they got back, York was like, I did a lot of work. I'm getting the hell out of here. And just skip town. But either way, a lesser-known explorer in this time was Lieutenant Zebulon Pike. I like this guy because he's got a fun name. He went along the Rocky Mountains and then down towards Mexico. However, he crossed the border into Mexico and was captured by Mexican troops. But since we weren't really at war with Mexico, they just walked him through the area and returned him to, I think, Louisiana. Louisiana, the modern state, not just the big territory. So it was they didn't throw him in chains and mistreat him the whole way. They were just like, hey, you're in the wrong place. We'll bring you back to where you need to be. And over the course of the travels, Pike got to get a lay of the land that would eventually be the southwestern United States, but also heard the Mexican soldiers complaining about Spanish rule and how they were planning on overthrowing Spain. So this dude that just ended up getting captured because he was wandering in the wrong place not only got more surveying done, but also we got information about what Mexico was about to do, which we were cool with that. It's not like we were like, hey, Spain, Mexico's going to rebel. But he got intel that would have been really hard to get otherwise because he was just there and hanging out and things were pretty okay. So I like that nothing bad really happened. So this is America after the Louisiana Purchase. Again, we had these Northwest Territories, and now we had all of this. This will continue to be an issue for a while, but we won't worry about that right now. And then this, of course, is all Spanish control, which then goes down into Mexico. There is the expedition with this is a real famous image of Lewis and Clark and Sacagawea. And also York. For some reason, I also couldn't find an image of this other than a children's book. But hey, history is history, and if we're going to teach kids history, all the better. And of course, Zebulon Pike's expedition. He did one up north, and then did all this, named Pike's Peak, which is great. It's still there. It's still a thing. They still call it that. And then, as we saw from that previous map, about here is Mexican territory. So he got in trouble, and they walked him around, and then dropped him back off on the other side of the what's that, the Red River? Yeah. Okay. It's 9:45. Get out of here. I'll see y'all on Wednesday, and we'll do more of this chapter. Also, if